Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
ABC News reports South Sudan's leader discusses closer ties in energy and trade with Russian President Putin. Visiting South Sudan President Salva Kiir has agreed in a meeting with Russia's president to expand their relationship in energy, trade, and other areas, notably oil. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Kiir and Putin met in Moscow last Thursday and discussed political and security matters in South Sudan, which is preparing for its first presidential election in December of next year. The country won independence from Sudan in 2011, and Kiir has led the country since then. This is only the beginning. We have many good opportunities in a variety of fields, including energy, Putin said. Russia's invitation to Kiir to visit came as global powers reach out to African nations. And it's interesting, Dr. Horne, that not only has President Putin met with President of South Sudan, he also met with the leader of North Korea shortly before that. There are a whole lot of meetings and a whole lot of conversations and a whole lot of agreements being made, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, that is for sure. And of course, the ultimate will take place within days when President Putin pitches up in Beijing to meet with President Xi Jinping, which will be the summit of all summits, perhaps the most important bilateral summit taking place to this very day. But with regard to South Sudan, that particular meeting should also not be ignored. As you correctly pointed out, South Sudan seceded from the larger Sudan in 2011, not least because the United States wanted to break up that country, and the United States wanted to break up that country in league with Israel wanting to break up that country because it would seem as part of the so-called rejectionist front of the Arab League, which was quite militant with regard to the Palestinian question. Keep in mind as well that there was further reason to strike back at the larger Sudan because before the rise of the current era, going back to 1956 when it attained independence, it was a thorn in the side of the North Atlantic powers because the regime tolerated one of the most important communist parties on the African continent. However, this meeting with President Salva Kiir is of a different character because even though Salva Kiir still styles and wears, as you see in the photos, this Texas cowboy hat, which is sort of homage to George W. Bush, who was seen as a man who helped to instigate secession in 2011, which was not altogether inaccurate. This oil deal that's going to come out of this meeting between Russia and South Sudan is a further concern to the North Atlantic powers because already there's concern that Russia's relationship to Saudi Arabia and its inclusion in so-called OPEC Plus, that's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries plus Russia, gives Moscow too much influence with regard to oil markets, that is to say the lifeblood of industrialized capitalist countries. And this meeting with Salva Kiir would do little to dispel that gloomy scenario. And I should also say that there is an even more intriguing aspect to this meeting. Because of the fact that South Sudan had been racked with conflict, not only before independence in 2011, but afterwards, because, of course, a civil war unfolded shortly thereafter, and there are still remnants of that civil war. And so, as a result, poachers were not able to invade South Sudan as they have done in, for example, Kenya and Tanzania. And so now what I call the eco-imperialists have discovered that South Sudan has a plethora of various animals and various animals that are seen as being subject either to exploitation or alternatively turning South Sudan into a giant game park and disregarding the interests of the human beings that live there. And they may feel that with this Moscow meeting, that particular diabolical plan perhaps also will run aground. And they have reason to suspect that is so because South Sudan was represented at the St. Petersburg summit just weeks ago in Russia, featuring leaders from African nations, heads of state and government. And then there's a larger question that we should not ignore. And that question is that you don't have to be a keen student of history to recognize that the rise of the North Atlantic powers, including the United States and its sidekick London, was premised upon shameless exploitation of Africa. That's why you have tens of millions of Africans, particularly African Americans, walking the streets of this country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And likewise, it's reasonable to suspect that the decline of these North Atlantic nations is being espied in Africa because obviously, as South Sudan suggests, despite the fact that George W. Bush helped to promote secession, they're not necessarily looking to Washington in order to advance in a socioeconomic level. And that bespeaks the continuing crisis of the North Atlantic countries when the nations in Africa, which they had ridden like a horse, are now seeking other options. And of course, you see that in South Sudan's neighbors as well. We've talked on this program about the ongoing revolt in Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali against French neocolonialism and how those three nations have now come together to forge an alliance to thwart any rumored military intervention. You see that with regard to the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which has now extended invitations to Egypt and Ethiopia. You see this also in this extraordinary article that I recommend to your audience in the September 30th, 2023 New York Times. They talked about the popularity of Russian flags in Niger, which is a continuing sign that Niger is also looking for alternatives to French neocolonialism. You saw this as well when a few months ago, Vice President Kamala Harris visited Accra, Lusaka, and Dar es Salaam. Interestingly enough, every airport she landed at in Ghana, Zambia, and Tanzania were either designed or built by Chinese interests. You see this at the recent G20 meeting in New Delhi, where an invitation was extended to the African Union. So it's now the G21. Obviously, Washington and its allies are scrambling, trying to play catch-up ball. And so now they're acceding to a request that should have been granted years ago. I'm afraid to say, however, that all of these Copernican changes are eluding and evading the attention of many African Americans who still are operating on the archaic premise that the deal that they had cut some decades ago, that is to say, in return for turning its back on foreign policy, they would only stick to their domestic knitting, and it's a kind of married to the mob scenario. That is to say, the Black American leaders, even intellectuals, often say or often indicate that they don't care how the booty was obtained in terms of imperialism. They just want to make sure they get their cut. Well, that particular bargain has lived past its sell-by date. It has expired. And we see this as well with all of this disturbing talk about the rise of a unique kind of neo-fascism in the United States, which, of course, would have the Black community as a primary victim.
We actually had a Thomas Mountain, who is a an African independent journalist was telling us in one of our shows that there was he mentioned a particular woman in Africa who she made money by sewing Russian flags and selling them on the street, which is interesting because the New York Times article indicated that Russia was smuggling Russian flags into Africa and handing them out. Niger has accepted Algeria's initiative for a peaceful political settlement of the crisis in the country, the Algerian Foreign Ministry said on Monday, which again, Algeria is very close with Moscow. That's probably alarming to the U.S. empire. Dr. Horne.
Alarming indeed. And you should add that bit of news to that litany I just recited. What I mean by that is, with Algeria breaking ranks and not engaging in solidarity with its former colonial master, speaking of France, that is an indication that Niger will probably be able to stand up to French pressure. This should not be surprising to those who pay attention to what goes on in Algiers, because we know that despite the recent setbacks, post-1962 Algeria, post-independence Algeria, was quite close to socialist Cuba. In fact, one of the first delegations of medics from socialist Cuba were dispatched indeed to Algiers circa 1962. We know that Algiers once hosted the primary foreign diplomatic mission of the Black Panther Party, from which the Black Panther Party, I'm going to report in my next book, were able to then accumulate arms from various countries by meeting with various delegations in Algiers in order to launch armed struggle, believe it or not, in the United States of America. We also know that the European Union, which has painted itself into a corner because of its wrong-headed boycott on Russia, is now even more dependent upon Algerian natural gas than it was previously. And so with this Niger-Algeria deal, we also see the possibility of a backdoor from Algeria, the northern neighbor of Niger, being opened, which will allow the influx and facilitation of aid from Russia, from China, in order to rescue the Niger economy, which is now under a kind of blockade by the giant of the continent, speaking of Nigeria. Speaking of Nigeria, they obviously need to rethink, because forces are aligning that do not bode well for their current foreign policy trajectory. But if history is any guide, I do not think that these signs will be heeded in Abuja.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.